Where's Joey?
Joey ate my last stick of gum, so I killed him. Do you think that was wrong?
Alexander Pope, in his essay on criticism, famously penned that to err is human, to forgive, divine. But we're all humans, not God, so are things really so clear-cut outside of poetry? When people have been wronged, whether as individuals or as a group, seeking restitution is a key component of our legal system, which provides an avenue to restore some of that which has been lost. But in our day-to-day lives, most transgressions are far too insignificant to warrant legal action. Thus, for most of us, we are left with two general options to respond to injustice: get over it or get even. Whether it be over-policing and racial discrimination that sparked fiery but peaceful protests across the United States for months in the summer of 2020, the COVID lockdowns and mandate demonstrations from truckers in Canada, or the zero-COVID policy resistance movement in China, or just something as benign as being banned from social media for, well, any number of political reasons, when people across the world feel as if we are the victims of some injustice, we tend to seek some form of resolution, and sometimes even vengeance, against those who we believed have wronged us. In March of 2022, neuroscientist Scott Small penned a piece in the New York Times titled, quote, "We will forget much of the pandemic. That's a good thing," wherein he comforts his readers from his scientific background that, luckily, we will probably forget some of the fear and anger that ran so rampant, and as the title explicitly states, that's a good thing. By October, Atlantic writer Emily Oster was not content with just forgetting, but instead demanded amnesty from those who had been ostracized, lost their jobs, family and friends, and even been denied medical treatment because those who pushed for such acts just happened to get it wrong. By January, an author at IQFI, which despite being a satire rage bait site, could be doing little more than predicting the future, if we follow current trends, called to move past forgetting and forgiving and instead ask, quote, "How do we prevent discrimination against the vaccinated, the real victims who need to be doing the forgiving?" Perhaps forgiveness is divine, at least when the perpetrator has apologized, but is vengeance also always wrong, particularly when they have not? If not, what constitutes a just form of vengeance? Is forgiveness always right, or are there some crimes that simply can never be forgiven nor forgot? But before we look into the psychology of forgiveness, vengeance, and victimization, a sincerely disturbing series of topics, let me tell you about a way that you can help protect yourself from being victimized online from companies and entities that may seek to exploit you and your data. And that's this video's sponsor, NordVPN. Everyone needs a VPN to protect their privacy online, and Nord is a service that does just that, protecting all of your devices from malware, cloaking your data from prying eyes, and blocking cookies designed to track your online behavior, as well as obnoxious pop-up advertisements from disturbing your online experience. Nord is easy to use with a built-in browser extension for Chrome, Edge, and Firefox, and comes with 24/7 customer support. Outside of protecting yourself from those who would seek to compromise your data by hiding your IP address and allowing you to use public Wi-Fi without fear, with Nord you can also change your location to access media not available in your region. Don't allow yourself to become a victim of those who would seek to disturb your privacy by checking out NordVPN, linked in the description and in the pinned comment below, where my viewers can get a unique deal for 49% off a 2-year plan with NordVPN by using my link. That's just over $4 a month for safety and security online, plus an extra month absolutely free. You'll never have to worry about getting revenge if you're safe from victimization in the first place. Thanks so much to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. And now that we're safe from being victimized by hackers or even just obnoxious ads online, let's talk about the history and legality of vengeance. Revenge is a dualistic concept, as the Oxford English Dictionary defines it as both an act and a desire. In the act of revenge, individuals respond to a wrong by causing harm to a transgressor. At the same time, revenge can also refer to the urge to get back at a wrongdoer without actually doing so. Revenge is separated from anger and aggression in that revenge is a responsive construct, yet is separated from resentment in that revenge contains some expectation of behavior, while resentment is often suffered in silence. Although revenge is similar to punishment, it also is distinct, as punishment tends to be enacted as a form of restitution and justice, while revenge, in contrast, is typified by a pure desire to see a transgressor suffer for some injustice they have committed against a victim. Generally, there are two types of victims, those who are willing to forgive and those who are not. And the legal system, specifically victim impact statements, allow both sorts to influence the punishments that befall those who have harmed them. But even if a victim uses their statement to encourage maximum punishment, that's still legal justice. Is legal justice then the same thing as revenge? Is all revenge the same? Need forgiveness come with a price, be it a sincere apology, fiscal restitution, jail time, etc., or is true forgiveness given freely without conditions? Let's begin our investigation into revenge and forgiveness by examining the types of victims, types of vengeance, and the historical and legal precedents for how vengeance and forgiveness manifest. Harvard Law professor and legal scholar Martha Minow, in her book Between Vengeance and Forgiveness, published in 1999, explored the various ways a serious social injustice can be approached legally and culturally. She describes three forms of overcoming injustice: trials, truth commissions, and reparations. From the legal side of things, trials are, of course, the method that most directly embraces the rule of law in redressing injustice.
Who can you sue? Try police departments, libraries, construction companies, school officials, cleaning services, financial institutions.
By handing responsibility of exacting restitution to the legal system and away from the individual or group, who is often filled with intense feelings of anger and vengeance, said vengeance can be tempered, allowing judgments to be slowed via procedure, backed with documents, cross-examination, and the presumption of innocence, all potentially helping to cease a vicious cycle wherein the victim seeks revenge, only to create a new victim in the process. There is perhaps no more prominent example of the legal system being used to respond to a great abuse of power than the Nuremberg trials, which resulted in 12 high-ranking Nazi figures being sentenced to death. In the days following the Twitter files release that illustrated the collaboration between the United States government and its various agencies and social media to suppress information, including information from that same government's own Center for Disease Control and the banning of medical doctors, Nuremberg 2 began trending on Elon's Bird app, with many demanding similar trials be conducted for those who pushed for censorship and silencing. But was Nuremberg 1 real justice? Of course, the atrocities committed by the Nazis could never be undone by the deaths of a few of those in charge, which, even for those who saw those deaths as a form of retribution, did not include the most prominent and powerful members of the party, namely Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, and Joseph Goebbels, all of whom took their own lives and thus could not see legal justice. It also did not include the average German citizen and soldier who were complicit or active in fueling the war machine, let alone the scientists recruited by the US government via Operation Paperclip. It's not just for these reasons that Nuremberg had its contemporary critics, as privately then Chief Justice Stone of the US Supreme Court labeled the trial as, quote, a high-class lynching party. Atrocity and war go hand in hand, and almost every country on Earth has gotten its hands dirty over the decades. After all, what else but an atrocity could produce a song like Napalm Sticks to Kids?
See that family over there? Watch me get 'em with a pair. Blood and guts just everywhere. Napalm Sticks to Kids.
Of course, no allies were on trial at Nuremberg for, say, the bombing of Dresden, Hiroshima, or Nagasaki, nor were any Soviet leaders charged for acts such as the Katyn massacre, which allegedly appalled even the Nazis. So an argument had to be made that the Nazis' actions were beyond those of the seemingly acceptable types of war crime atrocities, and instead, crimes against humanity. There's also the problem of retroactivity. That is, the norms being applied to those at Nuremberg did not exist when they committed their reprehensible acts, and never before in history had such an international post-war tribunal been conducted. Thus, Nuremberg set a precedent. It was based on little precedent itself. But despite its somewhat nebulous legality, most Germans at the time reported viewing the trials as just and fair, and the developed norms were adapted into the UN's Genocide Code and in the 1949 Geneva Convention.
I want to say we drop bloods into Berlin, but...
Winston Churchill throwing up crib outside the Reichstag.
But if the Bloods were in Berlin, who was in Paris?
Why do you think the song in Paris is called in Paris? Because this was in Paris.
Yet even nearly half a century later, in 1992, when conducting the International Tribunal to respond to massive humanitarian law violations that occurred in the former Yugoslavia, or the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in 1995, the issues of retroactivity present at Nuremberg remained, specifically concerning the intention to commit genocide and war in the context of an ethnic conflict. Is it only intent that makes something a crime against humanity? Another issue these tribunals faced outside of retroactivity was the role of duress. While duress of soldiers was generally not considered at Nuremberg, given that the foci of the prosecution was those in power, it was of concern in those later tribunals, using Nuremberg as a template. For example, one Croatian soldier, Dražen Odremović, who had served in the Bosnian army out of financial necessity and engaged in the mass murder of Muslim civilians in 1995, appealed his 10-year prison sentence, arguing that he had been forced to carry out the violence by his superiors, saying, quote, "I am not sorry for myself but for my family, for my wife and son who then had 9 months, and I could not refuse because then they would have had me killed. Is it fair to prosecute those who were just following orders if they were following orders under duress?" That's certainly a question I think will be asked by many who were just following COVID guidelines, if not in tribunals, then certainly in private for years to come. If only certain people are prosecuted for following or issuing orders, such prosecution also inherently risks creating martyrs out of the few who are subject to trial and punishment, while also generating cynicism about the somewhat arbitrary reality of using the legal system to punish behaviors enacted on a societal level by the masses. Thus, while procedural justice via trial may do something to ameliorate the suffering of victims, it also runs all sorts of risk, be it of creating martyrs, creating new legal norms that could be abused in the future by bad actors, and ultimately can never enact restorative justice when the number of perpetrators numbers in the tens of thousands. As Tina Rosenberg said of the Nuremberg trials, legal action that, quote, seeks to do justice on a grand scale risks doing justice on a small scale. Their goal must not be justice, but justice bit by bit by bit. Trials, in the end, are ill-suited to deal with the subtleties of facing the past, end quote. If trials struggle with the potentiality of going too far while simultaneously never far enough to prosecute every perpetrator of a mass social injustice, then truth commissions designed to uncover crimes are even less able to satiate much of the desire for vengeance or restitution that many will rightfully demand. Minnow posits that most commentators on this subject assert that criminal prosecution is the best response to atrocities, and truth commissions should only be used as an alternative when such prosecutions are not possible. The purpose of such commissions is not restorative justice, but to facilitate healing by allowing victims to tell their story and be heard. Additionally, in issues of mass atrocity, many may not fall easily into a single role as victim, perpetrator, or bystander. As a student activist whose parents were arrested by the secret police is surely a victim, but if said student then engages in terroristic behavior in retaliation, can that student still be considered merely a victim in isolate? What truth commissions may provide victims, however, is a manner of healing through the truth. Judith Herman, in her theory of trauma developed using the experiences of Holocaust victims, US Vietnam veterans, battered women, child abuse victims, and incest survivors, found that the initial injury itself tended to produce diminished autonomy, loss of connections and moral principles, and then ultimately, the very will to live. Those who survive often then struggle with feelings of anger, both towards themselves and others, but through truth-telling, these traumas can potentially see some degree of healing. Further, coming to know that one is not alone in their trauma via a public truth council prevents that trauma from being forgotten, and in addition to illustrating the devastation of some social cataclysm on the public record, such disclosures can permit individuals to move beyond trauma, hopelessness, numbness, and preoccupation with loss and injury. Letting the truth ring loudly and clearly, even without legal repercussion then, can serve in and of itself as a form of therapeutic healing. But that ring must actually be heard. It cannot be silenced for such an effect to be present. You cannot simply demand that we all just forget and move on. A truth commission, however, not only forces the victims' stories to be heard, they, unlike legal trials, also allow perpetrators' stories to be heard without fear of legal retribution, such as was the case in the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which sought to shed light on abusive and violent behaviors perpetrated under apartheid, with the promise that anyone who testified before the TRC would receive amnesty for their actions or even crimes. But did the truth actually heal in the case of South Africa? No, not really, at least not according to those present for the hearings. For example, one police captain who admitted his role in the shooting of 13 people while asking for the victims' forgiveness was met with what a New York Times reporter described as a low grumbling. Although the purpose of such commissions may be noble, to heal society with the purifying light of truth, truth alone seems rarely to be enough to satiate the victims of a wrongdoing. While it can be a step in the right direction for social well-being, without some form of restoration, of vengeance, many victims will always be left wanting. Further, much as was the criticism of Nuremberg, only one side of a conflict, no matter what that conflict is, be it apartheid or authoritarian COVID policies, usually ends up running the show, and those in charge surely need not prostrate themselves in request for amnesty, as illustrated by former President Frederick Willem de Klerk, who won the Nobel Peace Prize alongside then-President Nelson Mandela, and withdrew himself from participation in the TRC, or perhaps even more so by Mandela's ex-wife Winnie, who not only refused to participate, she outright refused to acknowledge her own participation in alleged human rights violations, including allegations of noncery.
Nelson Mandela's alcopops. It is the quick way to get kids wankered.
To the largely private TRC, and instead demanded a public hearing, which she tried to transform into a popularity contest to feed her own ego. Today, the legacy of the TRC has seemingly done little to nothing to ameliorate racial tensions in South Africa. Thus, while such commissions may sound nice, they don't seem very well suited to actually treating social animus with daylight. The next option discussed by Minnow is reparations, of which those given to Japanese Americans interned during the Second World War is perhaps the most salient modern example. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988 provided an apology by the government for the internment as well as $20,000 in restitution for each surviving victim. But this award, arriving more than 40 years after the infraction, was seen by many as far too little, far too late. Philosopher Jeremy Waldron said the reparations could not, quote, make up for the loss of home, business, opportunity, and standing in the community which these people suffered at the hands of their fellow citizens, nor was it to make up for the discomfort and degradation of their internment. If that were the aim, much more would be necessary, end quote. In truth, there was no real way for the US government to repay innocent Japanese Americans for their wrongful incarceration, no matter what the monetary payout, although in the words of legal scholar Howard Zare, it may, at least, quote, provide a sense of restoration at a symbolic level, end quote. However, it is also possible for such attempts at reparation to come off as so paltry as to rub proverbial salt in the wounds of injustice. For example, and in contrast to the reparations given to Japanese Americans, in 1996, then-Japanese Prime Minister Hashimoto Ryutara offered a public apology and monetary compensation to the about 500 still living women who had been used as sex slaves, dubbed comfort women, by the Japanese army during World War II. However, only 6 accepted the payout. Others responded to the offer with disgust, particularly because the funds came from private donors rather than from the Japanese government. Many expressed more favorability towards the US Justice Department having placed the names of 16 Japanese men known to have enslaved women during the war on a watch list and barring them from ever entering the United States. Others simply wanted their stories to be included in Japanese history textbooks. Members of the South African TRC were similarly taken aback by the modesty of the requests for reparation from many victims, with one woman asking for nothing more than a surgery to remove the remains of bullets from her lady parts, which she suffered after having been shot while doing nothing more than hanging up her washing, while others asked for help paying for their children's education or to have a park or other public place commemorated to a deceased victim. In addition to the fact that seemingly a lot of people aren't very satisfied with reparations, with the offer itself often being seen as insulting and diminutive of suffering, there is also the issue that any reparations coming from the government ultimately are derived from the public, many of whom are completely innocent and uninvolved in the crime for which their money is being taxed to reparate. Waldron described this problem in that, quote, reparation of historic injustice really is redistributive. It moves resources from one person to another. There is also occasionally a fear from some victims that demanding reparations will portray them as greedy, as was not an uncommon sentiment across European Jews who cautioned against provoking anti-Semitic stereotypes by seeking repayment from Swiss banks, despite the fact that these Jews or their families' wealth had been largely confiscated by the Nazis, and much of that wealth was held by those Swiss banks up until the late 1990s. Financial reparations seem to be a highly contentious option for making amends, as victims themselves are not always amenable to the act, whether because it feels patronizing, treats injury as transactional, or paints the victim in a negative light. Of course, some have no such qualms.
I think what everyone wants to know now is, what are you going to do with all this money?
I'm going to reinvest my money into the community.
Oh, that's a very nice gesture. What were you saying?
But reparations are also usually accompanied by a verbal or written apology. As Ronald Reagan said regarding the Japanese internment,
yet no payment can make up for those lost years. So what is most important in this bill has less to do with property than with honor. For here we admit a wrong. Here we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law.
There are plenty of examples of institutional apologia, from Tony Blair's speech placing the blame on the British for the Irish potato famine on its 150th anniversary, which more recent documents have revealed was written by his aides, to the surprise of absolutely no one.
A man makes 50 or 60 accounting errors. They call him a thief.
Well, does it affect me?
No.
It's not important then, is it, Norman?
To the 2006 apology from French President Chirac for the arrest and conviction of Alfred Dreyfus under false accusations of spying in the 1890s. To Australia's National Sorry Day, which occurs annually on May 26 in memoriam of abused Aboriginal people. It was at least a shock to me that such a day exists in Australia, as Sorry Day sounds like more of Canada's bag.
I was skiing down the street with my moose. You know, you darn beaver nipple, you cut me off, eh? That's okay, I forgive you.
One of the key problems, if not the operative issue with these apologetic acts, is that they all involve people apologizing for things that they themselves did not do, and thereby lack sincerity inherent. As Nicholas Taufchis described in his book Mea Culpa, quote, "An authentic apology cannot be delegated, consigned, exacted, or assumed by the principals, no less outsiders, without totally altering its meaning and vitiating its moral force." And ultimately, any form of apology is reliant upon the victim to choose to accept it at all. Across all these manners of restitution, be it punishment of the perpetrators, financial payments, returned property, restored religious sites, or apologies intended to seal the wounds, none can somehow make victims whole or clean the slate of oppression. Further, any act such as these that we have just discussed, if that act contains the hope that the violation can be forgotten and treated as if it never occurred, intrinsically defeats the very purpose of attempting to repair victims, because victims are the ones who must individually decide that justice has been served, and because the moment the crime is treated as square, the questions as to its real criminality is then up for interpretation, and the possibility of repeat offense becomes more viable. Asking victims to forget, forgive, and get over it, as some journalists covering the COVID lockdowns in retrospect have proffered, only serves the desires of the offenders, not the victims. As therapist turned lawyer Andrea Barnes, no relation to Robert as far as I know,
"You should ask my friend Robert Barnes. Maybe you've heard of him, a little attorney over there,"
explained that, quote, "When something happens that is unthinkable, so inconsistent with our view of the world that we can't imagine it, we do predictable things to make sense of it. We deny it, assuming we misunderstood or interpreted incorrectly. We find some explanation that helps us feel safer. If we can decide we were responsible for the event, then at least we have some control. We try to push it out of our minds in some kind of voluntary forgetting. The problem is that for our efforts to make this event logical, we must maintain our role as victim, i.e. there was some reason why this terrible event was supposed to happen." End quote. But inevitably, as comforting as it may be for perpetrators to tell themselves that the crimes need to be lost to time and moved past, for victims, the crimes can't be forgotten, no matter how much the New York Times or Atlantic wish that they could. Ultimately, there is no perfect way in which a large group of people, and certainly not a government, can make amends to a group that has been victimized, just as there is no perfect way to prevent oppression, hatred, and harm from would-be dictators and those who support them in the first place. The goal seems to be to find a solution that prioritizes both balance and wholeness, that is to restore some aspect of what was lost, while also including justice and remembrance without obsessive rumination on past misdeeds, which itself can provoke further animus. Humans are not even unique animals in that, much like our ape cousins, we have evolved a sense of justice, being disgusted by unfairness. But chimpanzees have also been observed as planning acts of vengeance.
Right, wife. Life good. Wife fight back. Kill wife.
With no perfect solution, and with vengeance being a deeply ingrained, even evolutionary emotion, can we and should we forgive when both individuals and governments have engaged in some violative behaviors, or are we just built to get even? Philosopher Geoffrey Murphy further elaborated upon the various problems faced on the road between forgiveness and vengeance in his book, Getting Even, Forgiveness and Its Limits, a strong title.
You believe in Jesus, Senator? Well, you're going to meet him.
First, he notes that, as previously mentioned, apologies must be sincere, and an apology offered on the behalf of some other entity by one not personally responsible for the act for which they are apologizing cannot ever be truly a sincere apology. Murphy described two types of retribution that victims can seek: grievance retributism and character retributism. The former, grievance retributism, punishes the wrongdoer, while the latter, character retributism, concerns the well-being and state of one's character. Simply apologizing rarely serves as true grievance retributivism, argues Murphy, for just because the perpetrator now regrets their actions does not undo those actions. Although when lying about the crime is part of the crime itself, then admittance can be an aspect of reconciliation. But so far, no one's apologizing for the COVID lockdowns, only demanding that we forgive or forget. Law professor R.A. Duff emphasized that part of retribution is in the very communication of it, with punishment serving as an act of communication between a society and one who has violated that society's norms, which separates the wrongdoer from the community. Yet when society punishes an individual communicating that separation from the person for violating social norms, said wrongdoer need not actually be repentant, as the punishment was thrust upon them from an external source. Instead, when a wrongdoer punishes themselves, then the onus of acceptance of that apology lies solely on the victim, who of course can still refuse, but will inevitably raise questions from others if the repentance is sincere and yet still rejected. These quandaries also raise the issue of the concept of deserved suffering and who should decide when one has suffered enough in recompense for past bad acts. By admitting to these acts, however, and being repentant, the likelihood that a victim will choose to forgive seemingly increases, while the necessity of procedural grievance retributivism from the state is diminished. But still, the victim is the one who must decide to accept any apology or penitence as retribution, be it personal, procedural, or purely vengeful. To better understand vengeance and its motivating factors from a social science perspective, rather than a more legalistic or philosophical one, we can look to a meta-analytic review of literature on the subject from Grobek, Durskin, and Van Marl 2014. They identified 165 scientific papers, including theoretical, empirical, and experimental studies, as well as extant literature reviews regarding vengeance and psychology. Various scholars described how vengeance is a distinct emotion from anger and hatred in isolate, although it can contain elements of both anger and hatred per se, as described by Stockan 2003. Vos 2003 divided vengeance as a specific emotion into 4 elements: humiliation, damage to self-esteem, the belief that the damage to self-esteem was incorrect, the drive for restoration of equality of power, and the desire to cause harm, including the risk of excessiveness and the desire to elevate oneself morally above the other. Frida 2008 further cautioned that vengeance must be seen as distinct from hatred or rage, in part because vengeance can serve as a positive social evolutionary proclivity that deters others from future acts of immorality, and that it can help restore balance to a community. He also conceived of vengeance not so much as an emotion, but a pursuit, making it even more distinct from hatred or anger.
Do you know what nemesis means? A righteous infliction of retribution manifested by an appropriate agent.
Just as there are 2 types of victims, those who choose to forgive and those who choose not to, there are also 2 broad types of revenge, which we can understand by looking into seminal research from Gabriel and Monaco, 1994, who identified the 2 forms of vengeance as adaptive and maladaptive. Adaptive vengeance, while still seeking restitution for some wrongdoing, does not demand excessive or eye-for-an-eye justice in order for the victim to feel satiated, while maladaptive vengeance produces rumination, compulsion, and even obsession, leaving the victim often still feeling bitter no matter what comeuppance faces their abuser. The authors provide 2 clinical case studies to illustrate the real-world manifestations of both types of vengeance. In a case study of adaptive justice, although I wouldn't call the scenario I'm about to describe as particularly mentally well adapted, a therapist and his patient for 5 years, Mrs. L, conversed about her dissatisfaction with her treatment. Mrs. L begins by explaining her intentions to take her own life to punish her family and her therapist for not properly helping her, believing that her death would cause the therapist to lose his reputation and even career. When asked what she felt had been lacking in the therapy, Mrs. O responded, quote, "Notice, attention, you don't notice me. Now all I want is revenge. I want my pain to go away. I want you to go away. You do me no good. All you want is for me to come here and talk and have these miserable feelings. I do that and I feel worse and worse. If I kill myself, you would notice, at least for a while, but I bet your life would go on. I can't stand it, and I can't stand you. All I want to do is get even. I want you to feel the way I do." And if the adaptive example is basically the ending of Old Boy, well, just wait till we get to the maladaptive one. So, in contrast, an example of maladaptive vengeance was expressed by patient J, who had recently separated from his wife and initially reported symptoms of depression to his therapist. Over time, these symptoms became less pronounced, and Jay reported that his improved mood was because he had been, quote, getting out more.
I don't like where this is going.
When asked to elaborate, Jay explained that he had recently spotted his ex-wife at a bowling alley with another man, and in a rage, he broke into her apartment and shredded her clothing, saying the act made him feel better. He also began to express a desire to kill his former partner to get even with her. Although when explaining the reasons for their breakup, it wasn't infidelity, but rather his intense jealousy that had driven her away in the first place. Ultimately, the therapist felt compelled to contact Jay's wife about the potential threat that he posed to her, after which he terminated the treatment with the therapist. Wait a minute, this reminds me of something.
Hello?
Whatever you do, do not let Alakon leave that room under any circumstance.
Actually, he just left. He said he was going for a walk.
Anyway, neither of these examples sound particularly healthy to me. However, the difference lies in how these feelings manifested in the two patients. For Jay, his desire to get back at his wife slowly consumed his thoughts and emotions, leading to actual destructive behavior, externalizing his rage onto another person. In opposition, Mrs. L's expression of vengeance was based on ego stability and preservation, and while her words and thoughts were hurtful, she did not act upon them. That is, while Mrs. L was able to express her desire for vengeance through fantasy and verbalization, a relatively adaptive method of managing such negative emotions, Jay instead acted out his rage and continued to ruminate, leading to a potentially increasingly dangerous situation. Thus, while revenge is usually unhealthy, it can be at least sometimes relatively benign and adaptive. But who tends to be vengeful, be it adaptive or maladaptive, and who instead tends to forgive? A common theme across much of the earlier literature on forgiveness and revenge describes the latter as a disease that can be cured with forgiveness. But later scholars quickly recognized it isn't quite that simple. That is, failing to forgive does not necessarily mean seeking revenge. Just as the absence of seeking revenge does not equal the presence of forgiveness, and just as individual victims must decide whether or not to forgive, vengeance also seems highly individualistic. On the subject of forgiving and forgetting, the behaviors of individuals during the height of the COVID pandemic, as data released in December of 2022 from Morning Consult are indicative, that's probably not going to be a lot of Democrats, as only 13% reported not being vaccinated at the time compared to 37% of Republicans and 34% of independents. So as more and more asked for pandemic amnesty, that forgiveness is largely going to need to come from those who were negatively affected, that being center and conservative-leaning people. But will these requests or demands fall on deaf ears? What traits typify someone who is forgiving and who is not? We can begin to understand who lusts for revenge with a study from Brown 2003, who was concerned with individual levels of narcissism and vengeance-seeking tendencies. In his first study, dating couples were recruited to complete a wide variety of questionnaires concerning everything from alcohol use to cleaning habits, how often they argued with each other, and their Big Five personality characteristics, in addition to self-reported tendency to forgive, as well as the subject's perception of their partner's tendency to forgive, or TTF. In general, women tended to rate men as being more forgiving than other women. As the saying goes, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. However, when only examining same-sex dyads to account for this discrepancy, self-reports of forgiveness largely aligned with a romantic partner's reports of their tendency for forgiveness. Despite the fact that people's own perceptions of their own forgiving or unforgiving nature aligned well with the perceptions of others of that nature, those who were rated as more forgiving did not report less interpersonal conflict in their lives than those low in forgiveness. They are just as prone to conflict, but they're also more accepting of apology. Brown's second study in this set examined propensity for individuals to keep a record of wrongs that others have inflicted upon them, hypothesizing that while more forgiving people may get into just as much conflict as less forgiving people, trait-level forgiveness propensity may predict a greater willingness to put past injustices behind them. In the second analysis, university students were asked to think of as many interpersonal offenses that had befallen them as they could, either over the course of 2 or 4 minutes. If they felt over these offenses, how hurtful the events were, and if the perpetrators had apologized. On average, participants recalled 4 offenses, but only 25% of events included an apology from the wrongdoer. Relatedly, 26% of respondents said they had never received an apology for any of the offenses recalled. Women reported being slightly less willing to forgive than men, what a shock, but did not tend to recall more offenses than did men. Being higher in tendency towards forgiveness across all groups was associated with significantly diminished recall of offensive events, and of the events that the more forgiving did recall, they rated those events as less hurtful. Although it did not reach statistical significance, being more forgiving was negatively related to having received apologies. Thus, some people are just more forgiving than others, and those who are more forgiving are less likely to hold on to negative memories and grudges of past offenses. In a third study, subjects' tendency towards forgiveness as well as attitudes towards forgiveness, or ATF, as a virtue were measured in addition to a measure of depression and of vengeance, the latter of which was assessed with questions such as, quote, "It is important for me to get back at people who have hurt me," end quote. Tendency to forgive was only moderately correlated with attitudes towards forgiveness and with vengeance, and was the only variable of the 3 associated with depressive symptoms. Instead, when controlling for tendency for vengeance, TTF, vengeance was actually negatively related to depression. In those very high in TTF, attitudes towards forgiveness were not related to depression. However, in those very low in TTF, that is, those who tend to be very unforgiving, viewing forgiveness as a positive thing was related to depressive symptoms. Those low in forgiveness and in a desire for vengeance were the most likely to report being depressed, while the vengeful participants were about as depressed whether or not they were forgiving, indicating that forgiving others doesn't seem to be an emotional panacea. In his 4th and final test of convergent and discriminant validity, Brown again provided participants with a variety of instruments, including the TTF and ATF, an interpersonal reactivity scale which measures perspective taking, fantasy thinking, empathy, and personal distress, and the Big 5 personality inventory, as well as the transgression narrative test of forgiveness, TNTF, which provides subjects with a series of vignettes and asks them if they would be willing to forgive the perpetrator in a given hypothetical scenario. For example, imagine you are taking a college course that requires an end-of-term paper project. A classmate explains to you that they're having writer's block and asks if they can read your paper for a little bit of inspiration. You agree. The classmate simply copies your paper verbatim, and you're called in by your professor, who scolds you and says that you're lucky he's not placing both of you on academic probation. How likely would you be to forgive that classmate? I have to say, having had this exact scenario personally happen to me in a freshman philosophy class, I was not so keen on forgiveness at the time. But that guy got kicked out of school because, what a surprise, I wasn't the only person he had pulled that stunt on. But once again, tendency to forgive was positively related to attitudes towards forgiveness and negatively towards vengeance, and this time also positively related to propensity to forgive via the hypotheticals provided by the TNTF instrument. As one might expect, forgiveness was positively correlated with agreeableness, negatively with neuroticism, which is emotional instability, and was unrelated to extroversion, openness, and conscientiousness, which is described as orderliness. While TNTF was also positively related to agreeableness and extroversion, it was unrelated to neuroticism. And perhaps more interestingly, responses to the narrative test of forgiveness were only weakly associated with self-reports of being a forgiving person. That is, reporting that one is merciful doesn't necessarily mean that one actually is.
Am I not merciful?
Instead, the best predictors of being willing to forgive in the hypothetical scenarios were positive attitudes towards forgiveness as a concept and perspective taking. Thus, personal reports of being a kind and forgiving person are most strongly associated with personality variables, whereas reported willingness to forgive in response to a specific scenario seems to be mostly based on the value that one places on forgiveness as a virtue and their tendency to take others' perspectives. So, who tends to actually forgive? Maybe people who consider themselves to be forgiving, sure, but perhaps in practice, it's more people who value forgiveness as a moral good and are more capable of putting themselves in others' shoes who actually forgive. What other factors typify a vengeful or a forgiving person? McCullough et al. 2001 examined the relationship between these two traits and the Big 5 personality variables, as well as life satisfaction in a sample of US college students who reported having been offended by another person in the past 2 weeks. In their first study, subjects were given a battery of questions at the beginning of the semester, meaning the offense was one that had occurred over the Christmas break, a time which, while full of cheer, can also bring plenty of drama.
Stop. Stop.
regarding their trait-level vengefulness, rumination on transgression, desire to exact revenge against the wrongdoer in their lives, or distance themselves from that person, satisfaction with life, and general negative affectivity or negative mood state. Students then answered the same survey once again 8 weeks later. They found that people with higher vengefulness scores ruminated more, were less forgiving, had less satisfaction with life, as well as a higher negative affectivity. Additionally, people with higher levels of vengefulness tended to remain high in desires to exact revenge against their offender over time, predicting consistent desires for revenge more than any other variable and accounting for 23% of the change in revenge scores. Those who ruminated on the offense less experienced greater decreases in both avoidance and desires for revenge, while how much subjective hurt the offense produced was unrelated to rumination, suppression, and forgiveness. Subjects who were more forgiving ruminated and avoided less, but this was unrelated to positive changes in life satisfaction, indicating that forgiving and forgetting doesn't necessarily make one more satisfied, but not obsessing over a slight does help. That is, following the Atlantic or New York Times advice by forgiving and forgetting likely isn't going to make anyone feel any better about the wrongs that were done to them. In their second study, McCullough et al. Shifted their attention to the role of the Big Five personality traits on feelings of vengeance. The Big Five personality traits, which I have briefly mentioned already, are extroversion, openness to experience, agreeableness, conscientiousness, which describes a propensity towards organization or orderliness, and neuroticism, which describes propensity towards emotional dysregulation. They found moderately strong correlations between vengeance and neuroticism positively, and with conscientiousness and agreeableness negatively. Regression analysis further revealed that specifically agreeableness and neuroticism uniquely predicted being a vengeful person. As such, people who tend to have more emotional disturbances and be less agreeable are more likely to also seek revenge, also known as the pumped-up kicks effect.
My question to you is, are you ready?
Does happiness influence propensity for vengeance, or is vengeance only desired by people who are particularly unhappy with their circumstances, which often may be the product of misdeeds or injustices? Uysal and Satisi, 2014, assessed this query in a sample of Turkish university student participants whose levels of vengeance, subjective happiness, and trait forgiveness were measured. They found that vengeance was negatively correlated to happiness, while happiness was, in turn, positively correlated to propensity for forgiveness. However, when happiness and vengeance were taken together in regression analysis, the significance of the relationship between vengeance and forgiveness decreased, indicating that happiness partially explained this relationship. Further hierarchical regression analysis revealed that vengeance and subjective happiness predicted forgiveness significantly. However, there was no significant interaction between vengeance and subjective happiness. That is then, the more forgiving one is, the less likely they are to seek out revenge. And this relationship was stronger when one also reports higher levels of subjective happiness. Thus, even if one isn't particularly blessed by good fortune, those who are content with their lives and are more forgiving are very unlikely to seek revenge, which, when you say it out loud, is blatantly obvious, but hey, we always need to show these relationships with data. In addition to happiness, Satisi, Uysal, and Atkin, 2014, also examined the mediating role that gratitude plays in the road that lies between forgiveness and vengeance, similarly in a sample of Turkish college students. In this survey, trait forgiveness and proclivity for vengeance were assessed, along with gratitude, measured with questions such as, quote, "I have so much in my life to be thankful for." At the basic correlational level, gratitude was negatively related to vengeance and positively related to forgiveness. Forgiveness negatively predicted feelings of vengeance through regression analysis, both directly and indirectly as mediated through gratitude, with the latter explaining 39% of variance in reported vengeance. As such, much like with happiness, people who are more gracious and believe that they have plenty of things to be grateful for, again regardless of more objective individual factors like wealth or status, those grateful people who are also forgiving also tend to be low in propensity for vengeance. In summation, happy people tend to forgive, but forgiving isn't what makes one happier. So far, we can see that happy and gracious people are less likely to be vengeful, but what about those prone towards feelings of disgust? Could such a propensity make one less willing to forgive some infraction that provokes those feelings? Disgust has been hypothesized to be a fundamental and evolutionary emotion that causes us to react negatively to social or physical symptoms that are deemed unhygienic, such as to avoid disease. Because disgust produces avoidance behaviors and vengeance is an approach-oriented behavior, the potential relationship between forgiveness, vengeance, and disgust was examined by Richmond et al. 2014. Respondents were queried on their disgust sensitivity, satisfaction with current friend relationships, commitment to friends, neuroticism, and feelings of vengeance they held towards a close friend, and then asked the same questions 4 weeks later to determine how these variables may change over time. These scholars found that participants who were more sensitive to disgust when first surveyed reported being less vengeful towards a friend, and when surveyed again a month later, controlling for initial trait vengeance, friendship satisfaction, commitment, and neuroticism, suggesting that those who are more susceptible towards feelings of disgust are less likely to hold on to feelings of revenge over time. To summarize these various findings of who tends to be vengeful and who tends to be forgiving, it seems that people higher in disgust reactivity, lower in neuroticism, higher in subjective happiness, lower in narcissism, and lower in depressive symptoms are the least vengeful and the most forgiving. And that very specific series of psychosocial traits, well, it aligns fairly well with the profile of the average conservative. Moral Foundation's research from Graham Hite and Nosek 2009 was indicative that conservatives are more sensitive to the purity foundation and disgust reactivity than were liberals. Gerber et al. 2011 illustrated a negative relationship between conservative politics and neuroticism. Burton, Plax, and Peterson, 2015, yep, that one.
And I'm not taking down that tweet or acknowledging that my tweet violated the Twitter rules. Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who.
Identified a similar negative relationship between conservatism and neuroticism, as well as a positive relationship between conservatism and life satisfaction. Similarly, conservatives consistently report fewer mental health disturbances and diagnoses with mental health disturbances, including depression, as seen in Bernardi 2021 as just one more recent example. In other words, the people who share many traits with conservatives are also the same types of people who may be more willing to forgive. And while I'm not suggesting that the authors of the New York Times or Atlantic articles were in any way aware of these relationships actively or scientifically, I don't think they're actually aware of much at all, actively or scientifically. They may have just sort of guessed. And it's not a baseless guess after all, as conservatives are more likely to be religious and specifically to be Christian, and a key component of Christianity is to, of course, turn the other cheek and forgive others, at least on paper.
Black people!
And, well, there's some evidence for that, as we can see in a meta-analysis from Davis et al. 2013, who found an average correlation of 0.29 between religiosity and spirituality with trait forgiveness, that is, general forgiveness, as well as an average correlation of 0.16 between religiosity/spirituality and state forgiveness, that is, forgiveness limited to a specific context. While these correlations are small to moderate, they were consistent. Religiosity and spirituality are positively correlated to forgiveness. In total then, yes, it seems conservatives share many of the traits associated with being forgiving. And well, if you want to tyrannize a group of people for a couple of years and then ask that they either forget or forgive, sans apology, or even admission of wrongdoing, then I guess you might want to pick the conservatives as the group to tyrannize. Being a little bit less vague, it may be then, given the psychosocial profile of those who are more willing to forgive, may actually play out in favor of those demanding amnesty, as those who are prone to forgive may tend to also be those who were largely targeted by said lockdowns, that is, conservatives. But is that true in practice? Do conservatives forgive more? So far we've looked at mere correlations regarding broad-level personality variables, so instead of looking at proxies, let's just look at politics and forgiveness directly, which we can do in a study from Hornsey et al. 2017, who used online data collection methods to survey participants from around the world. Specifically, Australia, Chile, China, Hong Kong, India, Japan, Peru, Russia, and the US regarding their entity beliefs, social dominance orientation, reluctance to apologize, willingness to forgive, and the importance of apologies to the forgiveness process, as well as their political ideology. Entity beliefs describe beliefs that the self is largely stable and unchanging. Because an apology is a statement of transformation, acknowledging that past actions were wrong and implicitly promising to change and not transgress similarly again, if one does not believe that people are capable of change, apologies will almost certainly seem less sincere than they do to those who believe that people can grow and change. Social dominance orientation, or SDO, is the tendency to see society as hierarchically ordered and is a trait consistently correlated with conservative political orientation. The scholars hypothesize that because the purpose of an apology is to equalize interlocutors in some manner, helping to restore the transgressor's moral reputation while restoring resources or self-esteem to the transgressed, conservatives, who tend to be oriented towards social dominance, towards hierarchy, may not see the necessity of apologizing nor of accepting the apologies of others. And by the way, I don't believe that hierarchical thinking is limited to the right, only that social dominance tends to be. That is, that the smartest, strongest, most cunning, etc. type people end up at the top, and that those people in positions of authority, be they leaders or parents, should be respected. I tend to believe that the left has their own hierarchy, the progressive stack, which is oriented in the opposite direction, with those who are seen as the most oppressed being the most respected. The hierarchy that conservatives value is a pyramid, and like most games, the higher you score, the better, while the hierarchy that the left seems to value is an inverted pyramid, and a bit more like golf. The lower the score, the better. In their first study, conservatism was positively related to SDO, entity beliefs, and a reluctance to apologize, and was negatively correlated with apology bonus effects. That is, the presence of an apology from the transgressor did not increase the likelihood that one would view the apology as sincere, and subsequently accept said apology and forgive them. Conservatives then are less likely to apologize and less likely to view apologies as particularly meaningful. Specifically, political conservatism was related to reluctance to apologize directly, but also indirectly as mediated through entity beliefs and SDO when controlling for age, sex, income, education, and religiosity. Similarly, conservatism was negatively related directly to the apology bonus effect, but also indirectly as mediated only through SDO, meaning that, again, for conservatives and those high in social dominance orientation, receiving an apology did not influence their willingness to forgive in the context of a series of hypothetical scenarios provided to the participants in this research. There were some differences across nations though, as for example, Indian respondents, who tended to be very conservative, were the most unwilling to apologize, while Peruvians, who were moderately conservative, were very willing to apologize. Hong Kongers, who were amongst the highest in social dominance orientation, were reluctant to apologize, while once again, Peruvians as well as Chileans, who were low in social dominance orientation, were also the most willing to say sorry. In a second study in this set, participants were asked to imagine that he or she had committed a transgression against a neighbor, and were asked to record what they would say to that neighbor in response. The presence of apologetic language in these responses was identified by interraters, and just as in the first study, entity beliefs, SDO, political orientation, and apology bonus were measured. As predicted, conservatives used less apologetic language in their open-ended responses to an imaginary neighbor, and the other findings of the first study were generally replicated, indicating once again that conservatives are less likely to apologize and to accept the apologies of others as being truly sincere. One potential issue here, however, is that both studies utilized hypothetical scenarios and asked participants to essentially role-play a transgression, asking them to imagine their romantic partner had cheated or that an acquaintance had been gossiping about them. Ultimately, it was all imaginary, both the infraction and the apology. So I would proffer that an alternative hypothesis for these findings may be that it's not so much that conservatives are less apologetic and less accepting of apologies in general, but given the correlation between entity beliefs in this sample, conservatives may need to believe that an apology is truly sincere, and the very nature of this particular method of research was not conducive to eliciting feelings of a true apology, since it was all make-believe. In that sense, though, these two studies would be perfectly apt to apply to the Atlantic or New York Times articles, among many other half-apologies or non-apologies being provided for the events that occurred during the COVID lockdowns. That lack of sincerity may very likely reify these findings, with conservatives being unwilling to accept seemingly imaginary recompense. It's also possible that, being hierarchically minded, conservatives view apologia as a sign of submission, particularly when it is performative and not sincere. Should we all be willing to get over transgressions even if there is no real apology, though? Or should we get even? How does getting over it, or getting even, affect us emotionally and affect our societies? As lockdowns and restrictions end around the world, at least outside of China, and calls for amnesty or to simply forget the authoritarian measures enacted by governments and the regular people who supported them, the inability to see loved ones or even experience bodily autonomy at all,
that at this point it seems criminal to me, actually. I really feel that that if someone chooses not to be vaccinated, that they should choose to stay home, not go to work, not have a job.
While feeling ostracized from society for their personal life decisions, yeah, it's very possible that even though conservatives, who were the target of these actions, are more forgiving, are probably also going to feel a great deal of spite. So, how do feelings of ostracization influence vengeance? For answers, we can look to an experiment from Van den Beest et al. 2012, who used a digital ball-tossing game across 2 studies to create an environment wherein ostracization could be easily induced by simply not tossing the virtual ball to the participant player. In their preliminary study, subjects who were not given an equal opportunity to play with the others, either as individuals or as dyads of 2 players working together, reported lower general mood states, and that fewer of their needs were being satisfied than those who were not excluded from the game. With these results in mind, a second study replicated the first, but after the game, participants were asked if they would like to take revenge on the other players, and then were given what they believed to be a real opportunity to get even. Participants were instructed that they would be moving on to a different experiment and were given a questionnaire about their personal taste preferences in food items. After completing the survey, researchers gave the participants a similarly completed survey allegedly from one or both of the players in the virtual ball game task, depending on if they were playing the game as an individual or as a dyad. The survey always indicated that the other player or players really did not like hot and spicy foods. I'm sure you can guess where this is going.
What the
Subjects were then able to select how much hot sauce they would recommend to their former game partners to be forced to drink to complete their portion of the experiment, and were assured that their identity would remain anonymous. Once again, ostracized participants reported lower levels of overall need satisfaction and overall mood state compared to included participants. When subjects believed that they were playing the game with another participant who was similarly being ostracized and excluded from the game, revenge intentions were higher. Further, those who had been excluded allocated more hot sauce by gram amount to those who had excluded them than those who had included them in the virtual ball game. Dyads allocated more hot sauce than a single participant, however, the difference was not statistically significant. In total, dyads reported feeling less hurt by ostracism than did individuals, but were more willing to lash out than were individuals against those who had ostracized them, specifically in the form of forcing them to guzzle hot sauce. Further, those who enacted more revenge reported higher mood states at the end of the study.
The police,
I'll tell you what you get!
Call the police!
You get what you deserve!
To summarize then, when people feel as if they have been excluded from society, even if that amounts to nothing more than not being tossed a ball in a computer game, they tend to be negatively emotionally affected, and respond to this negative emotional state with a desire to exact revenge against others, particularly when they believe that they are part of a group that has been ostracized rather than just as a single individual. As such, it's not impossible to extrapolate from these findings that people who believe, particularly as a group, they have been left out by society, such as being unable to travel, losing a job, being unable to see friends or family, or were outright denied medical treatment, yeah, those people may seek revenge against those they believed have ostracized them, and will probably feel a bit better as a result, at least so long as that revenge is limited to the equivalent of a hot chip challenge. Of course, COVID lockdowns and restrictions were far more complicated than simply not being tossed a ball in a virtual game of catch, as we were all told that such actions were necessary for public health and for the greater good.
How can this be for the greater good? Shut it!
So when people think they are being ostracized or disadvantaged for a public good, are they still prone to seek revenge? To get an idea, we can look to a study from Stoughton, de Kramer, and Van Dijk, 2008, across 2 experiments. Participants in their first study were placed in cubicles with a computer, giving the impression that they would be interacting with each other as a group via the computer, when in reality, they were disconnected from one another. Ah, No Man's Sky.
We want people to feel the impact of other players.
Many months later.
According to Hello Games founder Sean Murray, there are plenty of things No Man's Sky will be for those who pick it up upon release. But one thing it will not be is a multiplayer game.
Each member was given 75 points to expend and told that if the group collectively gave at least 120 points to a public good, then the group would receive a bonus 300 points to split amongst themselves. Some subjects were told that correctly completing the group task would reward them and one of the other subjects with 33% of the bonus reward, whereas the other two participants would only receive a 17% bonus. Other subjects were told the reverse, that they and one other would receive 17%, while two of the others would receive the 33% bonus. Before beginning the task, participants answered a short personality survey, which was collected by the researcher, the real experiment in the study. After a few minutes, subjects were given copies of the answers to the personality survey supposedly completed by the other participants in the experiment and asked to report on how much they liked, accepted, or wanted to interact with other members of the group. After collecting all the participant responses, the experimenter left the room, returning a few minutes later with the results of this group assessment process. Subjects were either told that they had been ranked as the least socially desirable member of the group or as the most socially desirable. Basically, half of the participants were handed a sheet of paper that read, "You are gay."
ただの白い紙だぜ。
Afterwards, feelings of exclusion, anger, and frustration were measured. They found that participants who had a low interest in helping the moral good because they would receive little reward, expressed more anger than participants who had a high interest in the public good when they were socially ostracized and rejected. The results of this first study are indicative that those who are ostracized are generally always more frustrated by social interactions than those who are not. But also, those who have low vested interest in the public good because they will not benefit from working towards that public good tend to be far angrier about being ostracized. In the context of COVID, it makes sense then why many people were unwilling to go along with lockdowns and mandates after initially having been treated unfairly, as they likely had less interest in trying to restore what had already been taken from them for a lesser reward, if any reward, compared to those around them who were not already punished. Essentially starting from a disadvantageous position, and at best hoping to grasp only some semblance of former normalcy. And that likely just made people more angry and frustrated, rather than willing to comply. But did it make them vengeful? In their second experiment, participants were asked to play a distribution game with an anonymous other player to split resources with them. There were three options: 500 and 500, choice B, 560 and 300, and choice C, 490 and 90. Choice A represents the pro-social option, maximizing outcomes for all parties. Choice B represents the individualistic option, maximizing personal benefit. And choice C represents the competitive option, taking fewer personal rewards in exchange for giving the other player the worst available outcome. In addition to this game, subjects again played the public good dilemma game from the first experiment, allegedly with a group of 3 other participants, all given 75 points each and with a 300-point bonus for groups that collectively donated 120 points. And just as before, some subjects were told that their personality profile made them the least or most socially desirable member of the group. This time, after receiving the assessments from their supposed group members, participants were asked to what extent they would be willing to leave the group, even if that meant sacrificing their own and the group's bonus, and to what extent they would like to get revenge on their fellow group members. Those who were accepted by the group always reported less negative affect than did those who were rejected, but those who chose the option in the distribution game that benefited themselves experienced the strongest negative reactions when they were also in the low interest condition, being given only 17% of the public good bonus rather than 33%. There was no difference in negative affect between pro-socials and pro-selfs in the high interest condition, wherein the participant would receive 33% of the bonus. As such, people who have been ostracized and treated unfairly, unsurprisingly, were the most angered and frustrated by this experience. Those who were socially accepted did not unilaterally contribute more to the group, as socially rejected pro-selfs, who would receive 33% of the bonus and benefit unfairly, contributed more to the group as well. Interestingly, pro-social individuals who gave an even split on the distribution game contributed the most when they were in the low interest condition, receiving only 17% of the bonus, specifically when they were also being socially ostracized. Truly bottom behavior.
Tell me, what job do you do in Minecraft? You like to build? Do you? If you do, you're a bottom.
These results may indicate that people who are pro-social may be even more so when they are being socially excluded, perhaps hoping to restore their image in the minds of others, while those who are self-interested will contribute to some group goal, even if being socially ostracized, so long as they benefit the most from group participation. While all subjects who were socially accepted were fairly similar in their willingness to leave the group, with the high-interest pro-socials and low-interest pro-selfs being slightly less willing to leave and lose their bonus. There was much more variation across the socially rejected subjects. Regression analysis revealed that negative emotions experienced, produced as a result of being rejected, mediated the relationship between group contributions and self or pro-social orientation. Excluded participants who were pro-social and low in interest were the least willing of all groups to leave the game, again meaning that those who chose an equal split to divide reward and then were treated poorly by the group, being given a smaller reward and being told that they were socially undesirable, were the least in favor of giving up and abandoning the group, indicating that some pro-social people may just be a little bit masochistic.
The only way you are not a bottom is if you go mining, and only tops mine, and this is a known fact.
In contrast, socially rejected participants who selected the pro-self distribution split and received the short end of the bonus were the most willing of all groups to abandon the game, likely recognizing the unfair treatment that they had received. When assessed via regression analysis, pro-self versus pro-social orientation was no longer significant, and instead, only negative emotions resulting from social ostracization was a significant mediator variable in influencing decisions to leave the group. Finally, concerning revenge, those who selected the self-serving distribution split wanted to take more revenge in the low-interest condition, where they received only 17% of the bonus than in the high-interest condition. However, among pro-socials, there were no significant differences between the low and high-interest conditions. Additionally, in the low-interest condition, pro-socials were amongst the least eager to take revenge across all groups. Much like with contributions and leaving the group, regression analysis revealed that when taking negative emotions into consideration, social versus self-orientation was again no longer significant, meaning that it was feelings of anger and frustration, not being selfish or selfless, that motivated people to take revenge against those who had excluded them. To apply all of these findings, which I know sounded a bit confusing, to the pandemic and potential amnesty, more self-oriented individuals would be the most likely to check out of society, cease contributions to it, and ultimately seek revenge against those who have ostracized them when they specifically gain no benefit from the system. Which, well, I fail to see how they would benefit from forgiving or forgetting at this point, so it shouldn't be surprising that many people just want to abandon the system altogether. In contrast, people who are very socially oriented towards others will seemingly be willing to accept their unfair treatment and continue to contribute to society and remain loyal to others, simply just bending over and taking it, or so it seems. Is that some kind of broad-level social Stockholm syndrome? Maybe. Or maybe again, it's just bottom behavior.
The only way I could even accept that you might be a switch is if you're good with redstone, because a top would get too frustrated and give up on redstone, and a bottom would just not understand how it works and try to get the top to do it.
It seems that there will inevitably be some people who will not forgive and not forget. And no, I'm not doing the meme. But does getting even make those who feel victimized any happier? Given that vengeance is a unique construct, being both an emotion and a behavior that exists in reaction to some perceived injustice, are there differences between those who act on vengeful impulses and those who simply ruminate on them? Kronbach, Rassen, and Horselenberg 2003 attempted to answer that question using a sample of Dutch students who they asked to think about a recent event that provoked vengeful emotions, which 64% of their sample were able to recall. The scholars provided 8 categories of behaviors that might elicit vindictiveness, of which the most commonly listed events were false accusations reported by 21% of students and a violation of trust, similarly reported by 21% of respondents, with 17% reporting they had experienced some other violation not included in the available options, but obviously referring to the natural vindictiveness of existing while Dutch.
The only love a Dutchoid can feel, if you dare describe it so, is that for money. A Dutchoid would sooner sell his own mother for a pouch of silvers than do a single good deed in his entire gaping hole of an existence.
Of those who specified what this other infraction was, 7% simply said that their feelings had been hurt with no additional detail, 4% said they had not been taken seriously, and 2% each either said they had been bullied or incurred some material damage. Of the pre-existing categories, unfaithfulness was the least commonly reported provocative event at 6% frequency, followed by friendship or relationship breakup at 8% frequency, and lying about something important at 9% frequency. In terms of actually getting even and not just mulling it over, 29% of respondents reported that they had acted upon feelings of vengeance, and more men disclosed having gotten revenge than did women. That sounds like some social desirability bias to me.
Don't care, didn't ask, cry about it, stay mad, get real, L-mold, seed cope.
The most commonly reported actions of vengeance were doing the same behavior back onto the perpetrator, reported by 31% of respondents, and telling the perpetrator the truth loud and clear, also reported by 31%. Physical violence was the least common form of vengeance, reported by only 8% of those who chose to get even, and thereby 3% of the total sample. For those who chose the other option for vengeance, 4 specified that their preferred form of revenge was to ignore the perpetrator. 4 who selected this option did not specify, and 2 gave some other response. Those who enacted revenge most frequently reported feeling satisfied, 58%. The next most common feelings experienced after having gotten even were feelings of being triumphant by 16% of subjects, and other selected by 12%. Participants who chose the other option elaborated that 4 of them still felt angry afterwards. 3 said they felt bad, 1 that he or she felt childish, and 1 that he or she felt relieved. Shame was the least commonly reported emotion, reported by only 3% of the vengeful. Thus, getting even actually doesn't seem to be so harmful of an act emotionally. The 2 positive emotions, triumph and satisfaction, collectively were by far more prevalent than the negative ones, comprising 74% of vengeful behaviors and illustrating that when people do seek out some form of vengeance, it more often than not seems to make the vengeful feel a little bit better. When asked why they chose to seek revenge, desire to establish autonomy and respect was most common, with the response, quote, "No one walks all over me," selected by the majority, 54% of respondents. Following that, restoration of damaged self-esteem was the reported intent of 16% of subjects, and then serving as a deterrence for future wrongful behavior, which 10% chose as their rationale. A desire to inflict an equal amount of pain was the least frequently chosen reason for revenge, selected by only 3% of those who did get even. For the 71% of respondents who said they had not engaged in vengeful behavior, 32% noted that they had used words to reconcile with the wrongdoer, 26% simply didn't find revenge necessary, and 17% selected the other option. When specifying, the most common other option, given by 14 of the 40 respondents who selected it, was fear of counter-revenge, while 11 of the 40 said that they did not want to lower themselves to the level of the perpetrator, and 5 reported that vengeance was senseless. 15% of the total sample of those who chose to not get even said they intended to but had not yet gotten the chance, and 15% were afraid of later regretting such behavior, perhaps being concerned about creating a cycle.
This is exactly what you guys did! Stop freaking out!
This is exactly what you guys did! Stop freaking out!
Actually, enacting revenge was relatively uncommon, but did those who went through with some vengeful behavior end up feeling less of that unpleasant emotion than those who did not? Both those who retaliated and those who didn't were about equally likely to report that their vindictive feelings had gone away over time, 31% for those who retaliated versus 30% for those who did not. However, slightly more people, 10% who retaliated, reported that their desire for vengeance was absolutely not gone, compared to those who did not retaliate, of which only 5% reported that the desire was absolutely not gone. As such, while those who engage in vengeful behaviors are more likely to report positive feelings regarding their revenge, they may be slightly less able to let go of the past transgression and move on than those who have not sought out revenge. When considering the COVID pandemic and the acts of oppression that were enacted by governments, or the acts of exclusion that average people engaged in by their own volition, from uninviting friends and family to a gathering should they not be up to date on their jabs, to outright disowning their family and friends. Just like the Atlantic demanding amnesty for everyone and entity that treated others poorly over the past few years, forgiveness of those who perpetrated these acts is only one aspect of healing. Can those who treated their own family and friends like second-class citizens even forgive themselves? And more importantly, should they? That question was assessed by Strelon 2007 in a sample of Australian college students who were surveyed regarding their levels of narcissism and entitlement, self-esteem, proneness to guilt and shame, as well as agreeableness and their dispositional forgiveness as it concerned the self, others, and specific situations that are outside of the control or responsibility of any individual. Those with a higher sense of entitlement were less likely to forgive others, while being unrelated to forgiveness towards the self and situations outside their control. In contrast, narcissism was unrelated to forgiving others, but was positively related to forgiving the self and situations. Being prone to guilt was unrelated to forgiving others and was negatively related to forgiving the self or situations, but also negatively related to narcissism. Both agreeableness and self-esteem were related positively to all types of forgiveness, the self, others, and situations. Shame, in turn, was negatively correlated only to forgiving the self and circumstances. Regression analysis further revealed that forgiveness of the self was not related to entitlement, but was significantly associated with narcissism, self-esteem, and guilt. Furthermore, narcissism was more highly correlated with forgiveness of the self than others. In summation, those who feel ashamed and are more narcissistic will not forgive others, but definitely will forgive themselves and situations that they can externalize as being outside of their control, or perhaps as just following orders. In additional analysis regarding forgiveness of the self, the importance of narcissism was reduced to non-significance once self-esteem and guilt were included in the equation, while similarly for forgiveness of situations, narcissism was also reduced to non-significance, with self-esteem retaining a unique association. In total, these findings illustrate that a person prone towards guilt may be more conscious of their role in a wrongdoing, and may be more likely to possess empathy for their victims. But it may also be the case that when harm is done to guilt-prone individuals, it is traits such as empathy, perspective-taking, and accommodation, rather than guilt, which become relevant to the forgiveness of others. Finally, this research evidences that while narcissistic people will only tend to forgive themselves when they feel particularly guilty, guilt is more of a motivator to forgive than is self-absorption. But what about justice? Does seeing an offender receive some punishment for their behavior influence feelings of revenge and forgiveness? Well, there's a ton of research on this subject in the legal literature. For the sake of time, because this video is getting quite long, let's just look at one series of studies here from Aquino, Tripp, and Bias 2006, who examined the subjects of revenge, forgiveness, reconciliation, and avoidance in organizations. In their first study, employees at a public utility service were asked to recall an instance wherein another person within the department or city government had offended them, if they made efforts to reconcile and forgive that person, or if they had attempted or succeeded in getting revenge against them. Participants were also asked about the climate of justice at their place of work, including how fair the environment was at giving promotions, disciplining employees, and evaluating employee performance, as well as their position and the position of the offender in the workplace's hierarchy. They found that hierarchy was unrelated to reconciliation or forgiveness, but revenge was negatively related to hierarchical position, in that employees were less likely to seek revenge against a subordinate than against a coworker or a boss. Procedural justice in the organization was related positively to reconciliation, but not to forgiveness nor revenge, in that when people believe the organization is just, they were willing to just move on, but not necessarily forgive nor exact revenge. Thus, when it seems that justice is being done procedurally, people may be more likely to just move on, even if they are no less vengeful or willing to forgive. We could surmise then that when justice is flaunted, such as was the case with the treatment of the Canadian truckers.
Now, is this Muslim Indians? Because I know usually when Muslims protest with trucks, they just run them into groups of people. So
that reconciliation is less likely, particularly when that injustice comes from those in positions of hierarchical power. To better understand that potentiality, a second study in this set surveyed MBA students at 2 universities who were asked to read a short story about a conflict between coworkers. The vignette described Pat and Val, employees at a computer parts manufacturer, who both were excited to work on a new project in the company. Val was particularly desperate for the opportunity, however, there was only one open space, and it was given instead to a third employee, Kelly.
Well, I manage my department, and I've been doing that for several years now. And God, I've learned a lot of life lessons along the way.
Your department's just you, right?
Yes, Jim, but I am not easy to manage.
I wasn't expecting such an enlightened answer from such
a bitch.
The company was either described as high in procedural justice, with managers listening closely to the employees' concerns and applying rules equally, or as low in procedural justice, with managers relying on their own personal opinions and applying rules with favoritism. Additionally, although Kelly ultimately received the job, Pat was described as having acted in one of 3 ways, knowing that her friend Val was passionate about the position. Pat either blocked Val's goals by signing up for a last-minute interview without telling her about the opportunity, violated the company's rules by using her friendship with another employee to negotiate an interview for herself, but not for Val, or derogated Val, with Pat speaking negatively about her qualifications during her interview with the manager. After reading these various scenarios, participants were asked about how they thought Val should react, avoiding Pat, reconciling with Pat, or getting revenge.
Oh, you people.
Just let it sizzle.
You shit.
Let it burn. Let it burn.
You assholes.
These scholars found that when the company was perceived of as being unfair, participants were less likely to encourage Val to seek revenge or avoid Pat when Pat had engaged in goal obstruction by not informing Val about the interview opportunity, while respondents believed both reconciliation and forgiveness were more appropriate when the company was high in procedural justice. In contrast, when Pat had violated the rules by using nepotism to secure an interview, subjects believed that both avoidance and revenge were more appropriate behaviors for Val in response to Pat's actions when the company was low in procedural justice, while comparatively, they were less in favor of revenge and avoidance when the company was seen as being just. Thus, when people think that the system is rigged against them, they will be more willing to take revenge and cut people out from their lives as a form of retribution when that person has used the corrupt system to victimize them. When the system is seen as fair, revenge and avoidance are less acceptable, at least comparatively. Considering the way in which so many were treated by governments using the veneer of procedural justice, be it the trucker protests in Canada, the forced relocation of families in Australia, or the utter authoritarian lockdown practices of China, all with government officials abusing their positions of power to justify mistreatment, well then, according to these data, both revenge and avoidance are probably going to be seen by many as acceptable reactions to that injustice. A lot of people did some pretty reprehensible things during the COVID pandemic, and plenty treated others as less than human, rather than simply demanding amnesty or to forget. Perhaps a little forgiveness on all sides could actually go a long way. So does forgiveness from a victim also help the perpetrator forgive themselves? And again, I must ask, should they? If we offer forgiveness, does that allow a perpetrator to absolve themselves of guilt? Is forgiveness then kind of a double-edged sword? We can answer some of these questions by looking to Wenzel et al. 2023, where in their first study, participants were asked to imagine themselves in a scenario wherein they had taken credit for a colleague, Alex's work. Some then read that upon running into Alex in the hallway, Alex stopped them to say that he or she forgave the participant for their actions. Subjects were then asked if they shared moral values with Alex, if Alex believed they shared moral values with the participant, if Alex's forgiveness was genuine, and if they forgave themselves or if they believed they should be punished for the hypothetical behavior. They found that the victim's expression of forgiveness increased reports that the victim believed they shared values with the participant, which in turn was positively related to the offender's belief that they also shared values with the victim. And an affirmation of value consensus was related to self-forgiveness. In other words, when Alex forgave the participant believed that Alex believed they shared the same moral values, and then they themselves believed in these same shared moral values and therefore were more likely to genuinely forgive themselves as a result. Alex's forgiveness was not related to the belief that said forgiveness was disingenuous, nor to a desire to punish the self. That is, when Alex forgave the participant apropos of nothing, the participants believed that the two were more similar and were more able to genuinely forgive themselves. A second study largely replicated the first using a similar hypothetical scenario. The takeaway from these first two studies, though, is that you probably should not tell someone that you forgive them unless you actually do, because your forgiveness gives that person a license to forgive themselves. Hypotheticals lack external validity, though. Thus, a third study asked participants to recall a real event wherein he or she had engaged in some wrongdoing and whether or not they had apologized for it, as well as to rate the severity of the act and the type of relationship they had with the person that they had wronged. Subjects were then asked to imagine an interaction with this person and that he or she either chose to forgive the subject or mentioned how the subject's past actions were still not okay. Participants then rated how severe the act was, categorized it into a specific type, for example, infidelity, physical harm, insults, etc., who the victim was, if they believed they had been forgiven by the victim in real life, if the other party believed they shared values with the subject and vice versa, if the subject genuinely forgave him or herself, and if the subject believed that he or she should be punished. The most common type of transgression was verbal disagreement, and the most common target was a close friend, and all were rated as relatively serious, particularly when it was a violation for which the participant had apologized. Respondents believed that the victim believed they shared the most values when he or she had apologized and imagined that he or she had been forgiven. And similarly, the subject themselves interpreted the most value consensus when they had apologized and imagined that they had been forgiven. Regardless of whether or not participants fantasized that their victim had publicly offered forgiveness, those who reported having apologized also reported nearly identical levels of genuine self-forgiveness, much higher than those who did not apologize, while those who did not apologize reported more pseudo-self-forgiveness. Interestingly, those who had apologized were more likely to punish themselves than those who had not, perhaps because apologizing forced them to recognize their own wrongdoing, and this was so regardless of whether or not the victim had forgiven them in their own minds. Is it any wonder then that the New York Times, The Atlantic, and plenty of other people around the world who know that they engage in authoritarian behavior during the pandemic, destroying their own relationships and often even the lives of others in the process, either out of fear of the virus or fear of being socially ostracized, are now asking for forgiveness without offering an apology then? Of course, they want forgiveness. It allows them to forgive themselves, even if that forgiveness isn't genuine. The very act of being forgiven allows them to feel better and believe that they deserve no punishment for their past authoritarian behaviors. Whereas having to apologize means having to take responsibility. And although that may produce more genuine self-forgiveness, it also produces an increased perception that the self should be punished for those behaviors. People like the author of the Atlantic article want your forgiveness, yes, but they don't want to apologize. They don't want the responsibility, only the self-forgiveness. By forgiving those who are not apologetic to us, we are turning the other cheek, and that's relevant in this case in terms of the phrase's original meaning. Roman soldiers, being as most groups are, predominantly right-handed, struck their equals with their right palm, hitting the left-hand side of the face, while those who they considered inferior, such as a slave, Jews, or other minority groups, they struck with their backhand on the right side of the face. When Jesus said to turn the other cheek, he did not mean to simply accept mistreatment. He meant to take away the ability of your oppressor to treat you as an inferior, striking you as an equal, not as a subject. Thus, should we turn the other cheek? Before we do, or don't, let's come to a few conclusions. Over the course of this video, we've seen how, historically and legally, dealing with a severe moral disturbance is difficult, and that there is no one perfect method of restoring victims through the legal system that satiates everyone's desire for justice, or even for revenge. We saw that while forgiveness works for some, it doesn't work for others, and that the people who tend to be the most forgiving are those who value purity and gratitude, are low in neuroticism and mental health issues, but high in life satisfaction and happiness, and that these are attributes more common amongst conservatives, the very people who might otherwise feel quite vengeful about, say, COVID lockdowns. We also saw that while vengeance may not make people happier, it's not always a detriment inherent, and instead a normal response to social ostracism and exclusion. Vengeance can be adaptive or maladaptive, just as forgiveness can be appropriate or undeserved. Finally, those who have done wrong seemingly need to be forgiven to forgive themselves, even if they are unwilling to even admit to any wrongdoing in the first place. In our current social context, these findings help explain a lot. Why is it that so many are so angry and yet so willing to subjugate others in a perpetual cycle of retribution and revenge? Yet if no one ever apologizes and truly apologizes for the things that he or she is actually responsible for, then it is unlikely that transgressions can be easily swept under the rug and forgotten nor forgiven, when no crime has even been admitted to on the part of those responsible in particular. But hey, what do you guys think? Do you think that vengeance can be a positive, or is it always only a negative? Would you forgive someone who never apologized to you? Let me know what you think in the comments down below to feed that algorithm. It actually really helps my channel out a lot. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out my sponsor, linked below in the description and in the pinned comment. And while you're down there, again, if you enjoyed the video, consider giving it a like and subscribing if you're not subscribed. Also, if you really liked what you saw, you can further support me by joining my Patreon or my Subscribestar, also linked down below, so that you can see your name listed here with these fine folks who have so generously donated to my channel. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, dear friends, Altana Volt.